Alan Mitchell gives an overview of two methods of dealing with tuberculosis and contagious diseases more generally. Mitchell details the 19th century models of France and Germany. While he discusses the strengths of each, he clearly endorses the German model and criticizes the French model extensively. Ultimately, though, the question raised by Mitchell is not merely one of disease, but also a question of modernity and the power of the state. Mitchell notes the deadliness of tuberculosis throughout Europe and in France in particular. He makes the argument that circumstances particular to France caused the disease to be far deadlier. Tuberculosis claimed 100,000 French lives every year, 15% of them in Paris. Comparatively, Germany did not face such stark odds. Mitchell makes a compelling case that this is due to, quote, strenuous efforts of the German Empire to treat tubercular disease and to lower mortality through public agency, unquote. Mitchell notes that the central authority of German health services, as well as a laboratory experimentation, as a key factor in this success. He also notes the, quote, eminence of German science, unquote, as well as its, quote, magnificent organization, unquote. While Mitchell gives praise to the Germans, his tone towards France is scornful. Mitchell notes not only the bleak mortality rates, but also that most French communes had no medical personnel at all, that their methods of data collection were defective. Further, he notes that some reformers considered tuberculosis to be a national security concern. Most damning, Mitchell speaks of, quote, French retardation, unquote, in terms of their medical infrastructure. He does not spare the rod. Mitchell condemns the French system in no uncertain terms and seems to think them foolish for not adopting German methods. Many considered Germany to be the most advanced nation in the world in the 19th century, in terms of culture and the arts, education, science, and ultimately medicine. Nearly everyone was trying to copy the Germans in some form. Quote, there was nothing so idiosyncratically German that it cannot inspire legislatures and the administrators of other countries, unquote. For many, German was synonymous with modern. One could argue that Mitchell continues this idea in his analysis. Yet tuberculosis was not the only thing at issue in the response to the disease. For many Frenchmen, with a century-old tradition of liberal, revolutionary republicanism, the question of tuberculosis became a question of liberty. Those who favored the German model tended to favor, quote, increased state intervention, unquote, while those who opposed largely agreed with, quote, Léon Bourgeois, who defined the fundamental ideological contest, once again, between liberty and obligation, unquote. Many saw it as a question of, quote, the boundary of individual liberty and public authority, unquote, and found that the German model would lead to social regimentation. These opponents believed that the German model was better suited for peoples with a military spirit as well as an authoritarian government. The French Republican tradition balked at these encroachments. Mitchell focuses upon French Republican traditions as a key factor in why the French were slow in accepting German methods. However, to what extent did nationalism play a role? The Franco-Prussian War was a humiliating defeat of France by the young German Empire. So devastating, Emperor Napoleon III himself was taken prisoner. The loss of the war and the seizure of Alsace and Lorraine was a thorn in the side of French pride. The idea of revenge played heavily in French politics until the end of World War I. To what extent were the French unwilling to adopt the methods of their most hated enemy? This factor is largely ignored by Mitchell's analysis. Mitchell's analysis heavily favors the German approach, and it is a compelling argument. out of the two, it does appear that Germany was more effective in containing tuberculosis. Yet, effectiveness is dependent on one's goals. Tuberculosis was not the only issue at stake. French priorities were centered around maintaining Republican traditions and an attempt not to emulate their hated neighbor. To accept the model of the Prussians was tantamount to them to abandoning their principles.